England, 1943. Smoke from a dozen test explosions hung over a cold, windswept shoreline as a small group of officers stared at a tank sinking beneath the waves. The machine groaned, tipped, and vanished into the gray water like a stone. Every witness shook their head. Another failure, another embarrassment, another reason, they believed, to finally shut down the strange Hungarian emigre who kept insisting he could make steel float. And yet, standing alone on the beach, coat whipping in the wind, brow clenched in frustration but not defeat, Nicholas Straussler refused to look away because he believed he was watching not the death of an idea, but its rebirth. What no one yet knew was that this rejected, stubborn engineer, dismissed by generals and mocked by colleagues, was about to build the silent miracle that would open a path onto Normandy's beaches and change the fate of the war. Nicholas Straussler came to Britain with the quiet desperation of a man who had lost nearly everything except his mind. Born in Budapest, trained among machines and mathematics, he had spent years watching Europe fracture into fear and brutality. By the time he reached London, he carried almost nothing with him, just a suitcase full of sketches, prototypes, and the unshakable conviction that engineering was a form of resistance. In the soft fog of wartime Britain, he walked into workshops humming with urgency, where draftsmen raced against uncertainty and young mechanics worked with the tremble of air raid sirens still echoing in their ears. And in that atmosphere of anxiety and raw invention, Straussler presented his boldest idea: a way to make a tank, the heaviest fist of the modern battlefield, glide across open water like a boat. But the moment he spoke it aloud, the room stiffened. Officers exchanged glances. Some laughed, some frowned, and one finally asked the question everyone was thinking: why in God's name would anyone need a swimming tank? To them, Straussler's idea sounded like madness. Britain needed guns, armor, aircraft, not miracles. Yet behind their skepticism, Straussler sensed fear, and beneath that fear, an opportunity. He explained how future invasions would require armored support right at the shore, how infantry landing alone would be slaughtered on open beaches, how tanks arriving late, bogged down by landing craft, would turn assault into disaster. They needed machines that could reach the sand the moment the first soldier touched water. They needed armor to appear where enemy gunners least expected it, and only a floating tank could do that. Still, he received rejection after rejection. His design was too fragile, too expensive, too untested. But rejection only sharpened him. He worked in silence long after the workshops emptied. He shaped steel frames with trembling hands while bomb blasts rattled the windows. He restitched canvas screens by candlelight, the smell of wax and oil filling his lungs. His doubts grew louder, whispering that the officers had been right, that he was building a dream no one wanted. Yet every time he stood beside the prototype, raw and ugly and unfinished, he felt the old flames surge in his chest, the belief that invention was a form of defiance, and that war had already taken too many people who never had a chance to fight back. When the first tests failed, newspapermen snickered, politicians scoffed, and rival engineers muttered that Straussler was wasting precious steel. Tanks sank. Crews cursed. Salt water ate through gears and pistons. But with every failure, Straussler saw a pattern, a clue, a hidden truth about buoyancy and thrust that no one else recognized. He adjusted the skirt height by a few inches, reinforced the frame, rerouted the propeller drive, and finally, on a quiet morning when almost no one bothered to watch, he climbed aboard a new prototype, felt the cold wind slicing across his face, and gave the signal. As the engine growled to life and the machine rumbled forward, every sound, every vibration pressed against his chest like a warning. Then the tank entered the water and floated. Not for seconds, not as a fluke, but steadily, confidently, its canvas screens rising like the wings of some improbable creature returning to the surface. For a moment, Straussler didn't speak. He simply listened to the soft churn of the propellers, to the splash of water against armor, to the faint gasp of the few engineers watching with stunned disbelief. It wasn't perfection. It wasn't ready for war. But it lived. His dream lived. And in the heart of a man who had been rejected, dismissed, and nearly forgotten, something shifted. For the first time, officers who once doubted him leaned forward, stared out over the water, and asked quietly, even cautiously, "Could this work on a battlefield?" Straussler didn't answer at first. He only watched the tank glide across the waves, cutting a clean line to home. Straussler's success should have opened every door. It should have filled the war rooms with excitement, unlocked funding, and sent engineers racing to refine his improbable craft. But instead, the moment the prototype floated, a new and heavier resistance began. Senior officers demanded proof that the machine could survive rough seas, not just calm waters. Naval planners doubted it could launch from ships without capsizing. And armored commanders, the men who would one day ride inside it, feared being sealed in a steel coffin wrapped in canvas, sinking helplessly beneath enemy fire. Their doubts formed a wall around Straussler, thicker and more suffocating than any rejection he had faced before. And behind every question, every hesitation, he could feel the pressure of the one thing he could not invent or control. Time, because the Allies were planning something enormous, an invasion across the Channel, and unless Straussler could prove his tank would work in every condition, the idea would die before its moment arrived. The next months unfolded like a relentless trial. Straussler lived in workshops filled with the metallic scent of oil and seawater, where engineers hammered and riveted and argued over every bolt, every bracket, every canvas seam. He studied weather charts, tide patterns, and the brutal physics of surf. He redesigned the flotation screens again, strengthening the canvas ribs, adding tension lines, reinforcing weak joints that had torn like paper during earlier tests. And with every improvement came another round of testing. Not gentle demonstrations, but harsh trials demanded by officers who wanted the machine to fail quickly so they could bury the project once and for all. They ordered launches during storms, in freezing rain, under brutal winds that whipped waves into icy fists. And every time a tank rolled toward the roiling water, Straussler felt his stomach tighten, because he knew that if just one more test ended in disaster, the project would be pulled from his hands and dismantled. And many tests did fail. Tanks sank bow first when waves slapped the screens too hard, water poured over the canvas walls, engines stalled, propellers tore loose. One morning, a tank capsized so violently that the crew had to be dragged out half-conscious, coughing salt water, eyes filled with rage, as they swore never to step into such a machine again. Journalists, catching wind of these mishaps, mocked the project in print, calling it a canvas bathtub for doomed men. Rivals whispered that Straussler was delusional, driven more by obsession than reason. And late at night, when the workshops finally fell silent and he was left alone with blueprints spread across the table like battlefield casualties, he let himself feel the weight of doubt. He wondered if he was risking lives for a dream that simply didn't belong in this war. He wondered if perhaps his critics had been right all along. A tank was meant for land, not water, and no amount of genius could change the nature of steel. But whenever those doubts threatened to overwhelm him, he remembered the soldiers who would one day step onto enemy shores. He imagined them running across open sand, exposed to machine gun nests, artillery, and fire they could not possibly outrun. He pictured them glancing back over their shoulders, praying for armor that might never arrive in time. And he understood that if he gave up, he wasn't just abandoning an invention, he was abandoning them. So he returned to his work, tightening bolts with blistered fingers, redrawing frames until dawn, pushing his exhausted team harder while pushing himself harder still. And slowly, painfully, the machine changed. It grew stronger, more stable, more confident on the water. It learned to ride waves instead of fighting them. It learned to recover when wind tried to roll it. It learned, piece by piece, to survive. And then, one cold morning near the end of 1943, the commanders ordered the ultimate test, a full tank, with full crew in open water, the kind of waves the Channel would unleash on D-Day. Failure would end everything. Success would rewrite the invasion. When the tank rumbled forward, the sea was merciless, its waves rearing like living walls. The canvas screens shuddered under the assault spray burst across the bow. A gust of wind tilted the machine so far that commanders muttered anxiously, ready to call off the run. But Straussler's design held. The tank righted itself. Its propellers bit into the water. And slowly, almost defiantly, the machine pushed through the waves and kept going, Officers stared in disbelief as it reached the rally point and returned to shore without sinking, stalling, or faltering. For the first time, no one doubted him, not the commanders, not the crews, not even the engineers who once turned their backs. A silent awe spread across the shoreline as the tank emerged from the surf, dripping and triumphant, like something forged not